Autumn for Black Tree, written and read by Oliver Tonic. Episode 1. The Weeping Tree. Sometimes she liked to take off her shoes so she could feel the soft, wet moss under her feet. Today was one of those days. She felt them squish under her toes. As she raised her foot, some of the particularly spongy growths would absorb the tiny puddles surrounding them. This was one of her favorite parts of the forest. It was just close enough that she could be back home in time, but just far enough that she could feel the freedom. It was so wet here. There was a gray mist that wafted in and out of the trees and covered the area from the forest floor to the canopy overhead. As the gray faded in and out, the deep green of the place played a game of peekaboo with the senses. As she hopped from moss to moss, her baggy clothes and her pack flopped up and down. She finally laid down on the soft, damp beds and looked up into the gray sky. She closed her eyes, content nearly to fall asleep there. Her hands felt gingerly at the soft floor as she found a piece of loose moss and squeezed it in her hand. It was nice to be away, and it was nice to feel some peace. She may indeed have fallen asleep there if the faintest sound had not been carried to her ears on the cool breeze. It was quiet, but somehow clear. It was the sound of someone crying. She opened her eyes, and they shimmered with the reflection of the canopy above her. She stood up and listened carefully. Along came the breeze again, holding the whimpers. She began to follow. The sounds took her to a dark part of the forest. It was an area she did not recall going near, most likely due to its unwelcoming nature. The air was still damp, but while it was cool before, here it was cold. While the moss bed was gray and green, here it was just dark. The cries grew more intelligible now. They were not cries of pain or a wailing of sorrow, but a whimper, like someone was trying to keep silent. In fact, it was so stifled that, as she grew closer, she was surprised she had heard it from such a long way off. As she approached, she saw a light like the light of the moon shining down onto a tree. She knew that it was the middle of the day, so this light was peculiar. It somehow matched the mood of the trees around, which were dark and crooked. In the middle of the light and the forestry was a large, twisted, ebon and dead-looking tree. Somehow, despite its foreboding nature, it was sprouting green and healthy leaves that grew from its mangled branches. Its trunk was wide, and its roots protruded from the floor, twisted and serpentine. The top of it had far-reaching branches that seemed to attack and push away the woods around it. She noticed a few of the trees close to it had the bottoms of their trunks being wedged upwards as if they were being pulled back and uprooted slowly. The scene was that of a slow and gruesome botanical violence. The weeping continued. She knew now it was coming from within the dark and sinuous tree. She approached it slowly. It was an immense and ugly thing. It felt as though it was glaring at her. The trunk looked like a mass of winding tendrils that stretched over and over each other painfully. It was a brown so dark it was essentially black. It looked almost as though it had been charred in a fire. She saw an opening in the front that she thought looked about as inviting as a prison chamber, but there was no doubt that the sounds came from within. She ventured on, peering cautiously into the dark insides of the tree. She touched the edges of the entrance as she did so and could feel the density of the bark. It felt like cold, rough stone. The weeping echoed through the chamber. As her eyes began to adjust, she could see where the light that glowed like the moon had cut through to the hollow of the trunk. She looked up. The hollow was massive. She couldn't see how far up the ceiling went, but it felt like a shadowy cathedral inside. The moonlight seemed to grow brighter as her eyes further adjusted. Soon, she could see a long black twist that cascaded down from the top of the cathedral. These vines, strangely, went from thick at the top to thinner towards the bottom. Where the vines came to a point, there was what appeared to be a man, a weeping man. He wore what appeared to be armor, but it looked strange. The plates on his shoulders looked as though they should have a shine to them, but instead were dark, like they had been seared. He had a dark complexion, but she couldn't see his face because it was buried in his hands as he wept profusely. His helmet lay next to his feet, but strangest of all was his connection to the tree. The long, twisted vines that seemed to be part of the root system of the tree were growing from none other than the man himself. He had tree growth sprung from the back of his neck and down his back. He had growths coming from his elbows and from his knees. The growth consumed him. He was generously covered in what looked like bark, where his skin shone through his armor. The metal plating that he wore bent in pieces where the roots had broken through. Despite the ugliness of the scene and the grotesque crop growing from the poor creature she observed before her, the girl's heart felt no fear. She reached out her hand, and her fingers grazed the roots growing from the side of the man's face. They were softer than the stony bark of the tree, but it was rough to the touch nonetheless. He continued to weep. She traced the roots upwards to the top of his head as it grew thicker. He couldn't feel a thing. He still hadn't even noticed her standing next to him. Finally, she gently brushed her fingers against the soft, brown skin of his forehead that wasn't covered by his hands. He stopped whimpering all at once and uncovered his tear-stained face to reveal his dark, chestnut eyes. They looked up to her and shimmered in the gray light that blanketed them both. She gave him a gentle smile. "Hi," she whispered softly. "Hello," he said, his voice cracking as he cleared his throat. The girl before him was clearly not dressed as nobility, but he was struck by her delicate features. She had pale skin with soft brown hair and hints of freckles on her cheeks. She walked to the front of him and sat on the ground, crossing her legs. She leaned forward and put her hand out to shake his. "My name is Paxis." Her hand hung there for a moment. The man cocked his head slightly and then looked at his own hand. It had little vines all over it that twisted around his forearm until it reached his elbow, which was tethered to the roots above him. With considerable effort, he reached for her and shook it. "I'm Barley," he said, clearing his throat again, trying to rid himself of the shakiness in his voice. "Nice to meet you, Barley." She was looking up at the chamber they were in. Barley gave a bit of a chuckle. "You're a brave girl. Most people wouldn't have come in here." She gave a slight shrug. "I heard crying. I had to know what it was." He opened his arms a bit as though he was presenting himself. "Well, here I am, the crying man." Barley looked around. "Wow. This has gotten out of hand, hasn't it? I look like a monster. Imagine that." "I see no monster here." He was clearly preoccupied at looking at the state he was in. He didn't say anything. "Well, tell me a story, crying man. You look like you have one to tell." Barley looked at her and gave a quick chuckle with a soft smile. "It's a terrible tale. It's about a fool." Paxis smiled. "Aren't all the best tales about fools? Stories about people who know everything are boring." Barley slightly cocked his head, the best he could under the circumstances. "You're a different one, aren't you?" "That's what they tell me," she said, but usually in less flattering words. Barley picked up the helmet next to his feet and looked into it thoughtfully before he sighed. "Once upon a time, there was a boy born with bark on his skin. The bark tried to grow into a tree whenever he had a heavy heart," he said as he thumbed his forearms. "Growing up, though, he hardly ever noticed. His parents were the kindest and sweetest of people. They gave him all the love in the world, and he needed it. Whenever he grew sad, the bark would spread across his body, covering more of him. After a while, it would start to sprout. Things like leaves and vines and branches. His parents would help him to learn how to manage it. They were not without their own afflictions, after all. They taught him to prune himself when it got bad, and as he got older, they taught him how to weaken the strength of the wood with his thoughts to make it easier to break off. But the more downhearted he got, the more it grew. So the trick was to keep it under control. His father would tell him, "Do for others and not just for you. When you focus on giving joy, you won't be able to help but get some yourself." So when he was old enough, he became a knight. He searched the land, hunting terrible beasts and coming to people's aid. "Wow," said Paxis, as she looked up at the high ceiling of the tree. "So all this came from you?" Barley laughed uncomfortably. "I guess being a knight didn't leave much room for landscaping." "So it can be cut off you then?" she asked as she stood up. "Do you keep shears on you?" Barley looked at her a bit surprised. He pulled some out of his armor. She leaned over to him to take them and then reached for the hilt of his sword instead. Before he could begin to warn her to be careful, she had unsheathed it. It gleamed in the white light. "We're going to need this first," she said. She reeled back, and with a mighty swing, she hacked at the bulk of the vines growing from the back of his neck that held his head stiff and upright. The sword was sharp, but not sharp enough to cut all the way through. She swung again. This time, his head was freed. Barley had a bewildered look on his face. Eyes wide, he began to rotate his head around. "Good grief, girl! You almost took my head off!" Paxis smiled and brushed her soft brown hair out of her face. "As a hangwoman, I prefer not to mix my business with leisure." Barley laughed. "You seem a bit small for an executioner." Paxis raised her eyebrows. "Then you can imagine how good I must be, since I'm their top gal." A bit out of breath, she gestured for him to stand. He complied, his body scraping bark against bark and metal as he did. It was labored, but finally he stood erect. He was large, very large compared to her. It was true that Paxis was a dainty girl, like he said. She looked up at him, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in twisted vines. He was certainly a sight to behold. "This is gonna take some work," she said, half to him and half to herself. She cleared her throat and went around his back. "You want to keep telling me your story?" She had a look of determination and focus aimed at the thick black vines on his shoulder blades. "You really don't have to do this," he said. "Of course I don't have to, but I want to." She raised the sword up again. "Really, honestly, I can do the rest." She had the sword lifted over her head. It was heavy for her. She looked as though she was so top-heavy that she would fall back before she could shift her weight and swing down. Yet she paused in this awkward position to give him a look. Barley smirked. "Stubborn, huh? That old double-edged sword of personality traits." The blade came down with a loud thunk. "I like to hear stories while I work," she said. She took the shears off his person. He had tucked them back underneath his belt buckle, resting on the thigh of each leg. She used them to sever the rogue strands of the vine left from the large cut she had just made. "So the guy hunted monsters for a living. What else do you want to know?" he asked. "How about how he turned into a full-blown tree?" she said, breathing heavily. He grunted as she continued to hack away at him. He said, going over things in his mind. "Okay. So the knight fought many a beast, enough that he began to think he could handle almost anything. One day he came upon a maiden who came to him in a panic. She told him she lived in a village with the problem of an enormous, bestial, and man-eating boar. This creature was vicious, and truly massive. It left trees in its wake as it barreled through the forest. She told him she needed a knight to come and protect them, to slay the creature and bring peace to her people." Barley trailed off and paused for a moment. Paxis was having trouble with a particularly thick portion in the center of his back. "You'll need to wet this blade when I'm done," she said, grunting. "And you'll need an axe in case this happens again." The tree was silent for a moment, and she realized something had gotten to him. She looked up at him and saw his eyes staring off into the distance. That seems like pretty standard fare for a monster hunter, she said, trying to coax him. Aren't distressed damsels pleading for help part of the job description? Barley focused. It can be, he said, but this time was different. He sniffed and started again. He went with her, and he slayed the creature. The battle was arduous and brutal, but he won out in the end. The girl thanked him and was so grateful that she begged him to stay and rest up in her village. She wanted to make sure he was well fed and well compensated for his journey and effort. So he stayed one night there, and then another, and another. Soon he found himself a part-time member of the community, working with her family and keeping up a patrol of her village borders. He was happy. During that time, it was discovered that the man-eating boar had had a drift of piglets. As the piglets were also bloodthirsty like their mother, they had begun eating the livestock in the area. Eventually, they too were hunted by the knight and a few others in the village. One such piglet was found in the maiden's father's barn, hiding from the hunters. She took pity on it and kept it hidden away. She succeeded in raising it in table scraps for a time, but he began to grow. She eventually showed him to the knight. He was apprehensive at first, but he gradually warmed to the idea. He agreed to keep it hidden and help care for it. He just warned her to keep it under control and tame it. They both thought maybe one day it could end up acting as a guardian of her people rather than a menace like its mother before. Paxis was listening intently. She was down on his calves now, cutting away the last thick portions connected to him. Barley cleared his throat and stretched his newly freed arms and rolled his newly freed shoulders. She grew a deep affection for the piglet, and at the same time the knight and the maiden grew in their affection for each other. A secret had bonded them in a way. Together, they... He cleared his throat. We nurtured something new. I began to fall in love with her, and she with me. I'd been in a village about a year when people started to disappear. I became concerned. The boar had grown now nearly to the size of its mother, and it was kept in a cave not far outside the village. She went out to see it every day under the guise of collecting firewood or wild nuts for the family. She groomed it and trained it. She could have put on a show with that creature. She had trained it so well. It loved her. Me, on the other hand, it had begun to despise. It could sense my concern. It wasn't quite right. The creature wasn't a protector of many, it was a protector of one. She was his only affection. Marin and I spent less and less time together as she was consumed with caring for the pig. It grew more and more hostile as it began to feed on the larger and larger wildlife in the forest. So when people began to go out into the trees and never come back, a pit grew in my stomach. The even darker fear that crept into my mind was of Marin. Often she was the last one seen with the missing villagers. Finally, one day I snuck into the cave of the boar when she was out training him. I took a torch to the back of the cave and found the creature's scrap heap of bones. Barley closed his eyes, and a tear began to roll down his cheek. Then another. They were not all animal. Paxis saw his tears. Then Barley felt her fingers on his cheeks. He saw her face full of hurt as she wiped his tears away and dried her hand on her dress. When she was done, without a word, she went back to cutting. She was using the shears now, but suddenly the smaller vines were getting harder to cut. Barley sniffed and went on. I wept there, on my knees in front of the pile of bones. When I turned around to leave, she was there. My torch lit up her face, and her pet stood next to her, snarling. She whispered she was sorry to me. Then she turned away. Her boar came at me with a ferocity I had not even seen in its mother before him. I was wounded. My initial shock overcame my abilities as the beast gored me. When I finally came to my senses, the battle was short-lived. Though powerful, the creature was young and inexperienced. Marion watched in horror as I struck the fatal blow. She rushed to its aid and wept over it as it bled all over the cave floor. Pax just watched the vines become hardened points at his elbows and knees. The vines grew subtly over him like black and green veins. She stopped shearing. I walked away from her and out of the cave. I didn't look back. That was the day I learned what the true nature of a monster could really be. Paxis stepped out from behind the knight. She looked at him as she clutched the shears. "I think he's free now," she said softly. Barley looked up and saw that no part of him was tethered now. He looked down at himself and lifted his arms. The weight that hindered him before was gone, and he felt so light he nearly thought he could fly. He began to stretch and turn around, dancing a bit to enjoy his levity. "You are truly a gift, Paxis." She handed him back his shears and sword. "It was nothing. I couldn't leave you like this." "On the contrary, you certainly could have," said Barley, "and I'm indebted to you." Paxis laughed and shook her head. "Please, this was an act of kindness and not a trade." "I implore you, ma'am. I'm a traveling knight. I aim to assist where I can. Surely I must assist the ones who assist me." Paxis gave a soft smile. Then her face turned to pondering. "I don't live too far from here. My land does have its issues, but I am simply a servant girl and an aide to the queen and king." "Forgive my saying so," said Barley, "but I am not indebted to your king or your queen." Barley put his hand on his hip. "I also know the look in the eyes of someone with trouble surrounding them." Paxis smirked. "You sound like a vendor at the market. Don't we all have trouble surrounding us?" Barley raised his eyebrows with a smile. "Sure, but unlike a vendor who wants to dig into your pockets, I make a free and formal oath to you. Where you go, I will go, and what you need, I will hazard myself to achieve for you." Paxis looked into his eyes. It was clear he would not take no for an answer. She turned and headed for the mouth of the tree hollow. She stopped and looked back at him. "Well, the first place I'm going is outside. I'm fine with your oath, as long as it gets you out of this miserable place." Barley nodded and followed with an expression of satisfaction on his face. Paxis turned around and shook her head. She walked toward the light of the exit with a knight in her wake, and an adventure to the fore that a girl like her could have never planned.